Hi Jairam, what is the difference between an interim budget and a full budget?
See, an interim budget is a short-term stopgap kind of budget, which is usually put in place when governments change and the new government has not yet come in and they're not yet ready. Think of it kind of like when we used to be in school. जैसे हमारे स्कूल में जब हमारा मेन टीचर छुट्टी पे जाता है तो एक सब्स्टिट्यूट टीचर आ जाती थी. तो हमारी सब्स्टिट्यूट टीचर रहती थी 2 महीने के लिए, 3 महीने के लिए. हमें पता था कि मेन टीचर आ जाएगी उसके बाद. इंटरिम बजट वैसे ही कुछ है, एक सब्स्टिट्यूट टीचर की तरह है. 3-4 महीने के लिए स्टॉप गैप मेंटेन करेगा. ज़रूरत क्यों है? ज़रूरत इसलिए है कि इफ़ यू डू नॉट हैव बजट्स, इफ़ यू डू नॉट हैव एन ऑफिशियली पास्ड बजट, many departments of government cannot function. They will not have the allocations that are necessary. Their day-to-day spending, their salaries, etc., cannot get paid unless they are allocated on a budget. And so officially you still need, even if you are waiting and you cannot make any big announcements, you will still have to give some basic allocations to different departments so they can keep functioning. That's where the interim budget comes in. It cannot do any big announcements. No new big schemes can come in, etc., like in the main budget, because it's not allowed, and that's the convention that near an election a government cannot do big action, but the interim budget will keep the lights on in all the government departments. So that's the job of the interim budget.
Thanks Jairam. Question 2, if you had to describe the budget in 3 words, what would it be?
Ooh, 3 words. That's it's not easy. Okay, first I'd say it's conservative, right? Which is what you expect in an interim budget. You don't expect people to play big shots, right? When all they need to do is actually protect wickets for an over. They're not going to play big shots. That's exactly what the interim budget does. It stays conservative. The second piece that I'd say, or the next 2 I'd mention, are on things which have been mild surprises to the market. One is an infrastructure spending, where infrastructure spending at 11% growth over last year has been much smaller than what has been in the last 2 years. It has been 30% plus, and now suddenly it's like just 10% growth. This is a government that has spent a lot on infrastructure in the last many years, so it was mildly surprising to see that small number. But of course they would also be impacted, I guess, by the fact that it's an interim budget. They can't announce big programs, so what are you going to spend infrastructure money on in the next few months? So that's the second bit. The third piece that I might say is on fiscal conservatism. Last year's fiscal deficit got brought down from 5.9%, which was the estimate, to 5.8 as a revised estimate now. Going forward, we are talking about 5.1%, which is way lower than anything anybody expected, right? So I don't know whether it will survive when we go to the new budget, but at least right now, fiscal conservatism, infrastructure spending being a bit lower, and overall just a conservative stance, exactly what you expect and what is appropriate in an interim budget.
Thanks Jairam. Question 3, what all do you feel have been kept for the full budget and wasn't included in the interim budget?
Oh, there's a lot of stuff. Like, there are no big programs here that have been launched, so I would expect something big coming on infrastructure for sure. I'd expect something coming on the rural economy, a lot more to be done in the rural economy. The government has been very focused on it, so I'm sure something will be coming for that, and I'm sure something will be coming in the housing sector for affordable housing, etc. And MSME businesses, there's a lot of work to be done, and the government has done a lot in the last few budgets, and probably more might happen. The PLI scheme, maybe something more can get announced in that space. So there is a lot of let's call it work in progress agenda of the government, which will need the next round of investments, none of which could realistically have been talked about in an interim budget given the constraints of it being interim. But I expect that whenever a final budget comes, all of that will come back in.
Thanks. Question 4, what happens to the interim budget after the new government takes office?
Well, same as what happens to kind of your substitute teacher, right? When the new teacher, when the teacher comes back, most probably the substitute teacher goes away, the old teacher takes over again, and you start the coursework. In other words, whatever the new government is, they come in and they say, you know what, I have now figured out what I want to do. I'm going to present a fully formed budget, and the interim budget lapses in the next 4 months or so. In theory, the new government could decide that, you know what, I'm just going to extend the interim budget itself. I'm not going to actually make new budgetary proposals at all. I'm just going to extend this thing for the full rest of the year. It's less common and less likely, but in theory that can happen as well.
Thanks, Jairam. How would this interim budget impact our business, really, as NBFCs and HFCs?
Honestly, not much. It's a set of short-term sort of measures. There is no major policy announcement here, so it's unlikely that it will have any impact. But as and when the final budget comes in, and there are conversations about what happens to the housing sector or to the investment or manufacturing sector, etc., you will see a lot more of impact on our business. The one area where there is a little bit of an impact is on the cost of funds side and how expensive money is in the market. And because the government has clearly indicated that they're not going to do as much borrowing as the market expected, that means that the private sector borrowings can get a little bit cheaper, and private sector can actually afford to make a little bit more investments. That's generally good news for financial institutions like ourselves.
Thanks, Jairam. Question 6. What should be the nominal or fair inflation rate for a developing country? Will the current budget really help reduce the inflation?
See, every economy is different, and there's no such thing as just like you say, like, what if I ask you, like, what is the right weight to have for a person who's 5 feet 8? Like, you'll be like, I don't know. It depends a lot on whether that's a male or a female, which part of the world do they live in, and so on. There are a lot of factors and what their habits are. Having said that, there is generally what we have seen is that developing markets have had or well-run developing markets have had 5-6% inflation rates. And developed markets, of course, have meaningfully lower inflation rates. That story, however, in the last few years has changed a lot. In the last few years, particularly after COVID, all inflation rates across the world have increased massively. So the developing markets on average have moved from 5-ish% inflation, of 4.5 to 5% inflation, to almost 9% inflation in the last year and a half. It has come off a little bit since then, but it peaked at about 9%. So as you can imagine, a massive rise in inflation rate. India bottomed out inflation rate at just under 5%. We have gone up a little bit, kind of, in the 6 handle kind of range, then came back down a little bit. Right now, we are at much lower than developing market average, which has not happened before. India has been at or above developing market average in the past, but right now our inflation rates are much lower. In fact, there was a point in time when our inflation rate was lower than developed markets like the US, etc., which is kind of crazy. It's almost never happens. But inflation is not I hope I don't jinx it, but inflation is not currently a huge kind of issue in the market.
Thanks, Jairam. Question 7. The budget spoke a lot about helping the poor. Do you feel that this will lead to significant development in Budget Bharat? Also, what kind of schemes can we expect for the middle class?
See, I think this budget, at the risk of repeating myself, did not have any policy announcements or any significant policy announcements. There was an announcement of intent, which, of course, it's good intent, and I'm sure it will get followed through with policy as well when the time comes. Right now is not the time in an interim budget, so you didn't hear anything. Having said that, I think policies of the past, like the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, for example, have done a tremendous amount of good in terms of augmenting home building capacity at the lower strata of society. In the Budget Bharat segment, there has been a lot of action on that basis. Similarly, a lot of investments that have been made in the MSME sector in the past have been super helpful to Budget Bharat customers. All those things, I hope, when the final budget does come in, will have policy announcements in that space, and all of that will go back to the same level of robustness that we have seen in past years.
The stock market had a very lukewarm response to the budget. Why do you think this was the case?
The stock market has a lot to worry about right now, and a lot has been going on. So it's and the market's very smart. The market knows that this is an interim budget, and there isn't anything major policy-wise that's going to happen. The only thing that could have happened was if the government had announced a much higher fiscal deficit, then the stock market could have gone down. So there was only bad news possible. Good news is not possible in an interim budget. Bad news is possible. So in some sense, the fact that there wasn't bad news is the good news that we should look at.
We are down to the last question. With the government looking to reduce the fiscal deficit, will we see a positive impact on credit lending in the country, especially in terms of repo rates?
Yeah, see, this generally happens like if the government is borrowing less, there is more room for private sector to borrow, and lenders are all part of the private sector. Banks, NBFCs, everybody borrows in the market from consumers or from other institutions, and there is more room for us to borrow if the government is borrowing a little bit less. And the government borrowing rate sets the benchmark at which around which the rest of the market's benchmarks get set. So if the government is going to borrow less, generally good news for everybody else who is going to borrow. So yes, one does expect that RBI, of course, hasn't raised interest rates in the last few policy meetings after being on a rising trajectory for a year and a half. Now, if the government borrows less in the future, there is a little bit more room for RBI to start thinking about cutting rates and passing that on, and all of us banks and NBFCs passing that on to customers in the form of lower rates. So fingers crossed, maybe second half of this calendar year you will see something, but these things evolve a lot, so let's keep watching the news.
Thanks, Jairam. Any last words as you close the budget conversations? Yeah?
I think it's been exactly on the lines of what was anticipated in terms of keeping a steady course, being very, very fiscally prudent and conservative. That's exactly what our country needs right now. And on the other side of the elections, as and when the new government gets formed, we will have a much clearer idea of what the policy direction of the country is going to be. On the whole, though, India continues to be on a really robust trajectory. Our macros are super sound. Our consumers are reasonably healthy. They're slightly less healthy than they were before, but they're still in reasonably good shape. Our financial institutions are in very strong position, and we have got a set of policy actions in the market which are all conducive towards growth. So all in all, it continues to be a great time to be in India.